Historians have theorized over the years that to truly test the strength of a person's character or an institution's character, you need to look at times of crisis. The idea is that anybody can be successful when the road in front of you is easy, but when the odds are stacked against you and you're going through your most difficult times, that's when you really get an understanding of the strength of someone's character. And while phrases like this are easy to slap on bumper stickers and motivate people to feel good about themselves, historians have applied this type of logic to analyzing ancient governments. And when it comes to a political system, the toughest test and the biggest strain and the times when the odds are stacked most against you is very often times of war. The ancient historian Polybius wrote that, quote, "The true test of a perfect man is his ability to bear violent changes of fortune with high-mindedness and dignity. It is essential to examine the Republic in the same way." End quote. So Polybius is subscribing to this theory that high stakes and difficulties are going to stress your character, and that's going to show what you really are. And he applied very similar logic to the Roman Republic. The wars that Polybius is referring to are known as the Punic Wars. Historians generally classify the Punic Wars into three periods: a First Punic War around the 260s BC, a Second Punic War in the early 200s BCE, and a Third Punic War in the mid-100s BC. The idea for Polybius was that Rome began this series of wars as a smaller regional power. Their republic, their system, their character was tested in incredible ways, and by the time these wars were over, Rome was the dominant power in the Mediterranean. And while there's no doubt that this is accurate, it's really the events of the Punic Wars and the results of the Punic Wars that ultimately begin the process of decay in the Roman Republic. The First Punic War is a great example of this trials and tribulations theory that leads to true character being revealed. So the First Punic War began in the 260s BC with Rome finding itself squarely against a powerful city-state of Carthage. Rome, of course, was located centrally in the Mediterranean, and Carthage was as well. So here's what historian Edward J. Watts says about Carthage, quote, "Founded by Phoenicians as a trading colony, Carthage commanded one of the Mediterranean's most advantageous commercial and strategic positions, and soon grew into a prosperous and powerful city. By the 3rd century BC, Carthage possessed the region's most formidable navy, powerful mercenary armies, and an empire that extended from Spain to Sicily." End quote. What began as a small-scale local conflict erupted into a huge collision between two of the Mediterranean's greatest powers, competing over territory, economic control, and dominance over the Mediterranean. When the war began, Rome found itself at a disadvantage in many ways. Much of the fighting occurred in Sicily or on the high seas, which was, of course, away from home for the Romans, and they had no navy to speak of. Carthage, on the other hand, having a strong and powerful navy, wanted to fight this war as much as they could on the high seas. So if the Romans were going to win this war, they were going to have to innovate. They were going to have to create essentially an entire navy. They were going to have to learn how to command and sail and use these vessels to destroy Carthaginian vessels, and they were going to have to do it quickly or else they were going to be destroyed. So showing that Roman character and ingenuity that Polybius mentioned earlier in the episode, the Romans do just that. They innovate. They build ships based almost entirely on the Carthaginian model. They build an entire navy of them. These ships have rams on them. They have boarding mechanisms for fighting. where you can attach your boarding mechanism to another ship and send soldiers over to fight on the decks. Historian Edward J. Watts says, quote, "Naval warfare in the 260s involved hundreds of rowers, often manning 5 banks of oars, working in concert to maneuver a ship until it could smash a metal ram on its prow into the hull of an enemy vessel." End quote. That sounds great in theory, and as I've talked about several times before on this podcast, as the great Andrew Stevener once said, naval warfare is a total crapshoot. So you can read these history textbooks from time to time, and they're describing how these boats are maneuvering around one another, and it's all part of a strategy, and there's an orderly flow to things, and that's all nonsense. Naval warfare in ancient history is a total crapshoot. You have to imagine hundreds of men trying to work together, inexperienced. Everything has to be perfectly in sync, or else you're not going to be going the direction you want. There's debris in the water. Ships are on fire. You're trying to avoid enemy vessels while trying to ram them on your own terms. None of this even takes into account weather conditions, winds, which can throw boats completely over, the conditions on the water. Ancient naval warfare was basically hungry hippos. But the chaotic nature of naval warfare and the chaotic nature of this First Punic War shows how resilient Rome was. So they were able to survive huge losses. They would lose entire fleets to battles or storms or men falling overboard. They had to create entire new fleets when they would lose a fleet of ships. Oftentimes there was no money left in the treasury, and quote-unquote leading men who felt like they had a service and a duty to the Republic would offer to pay for entire new fleets, entire new ships, and the soldiers to go ahead and sail them. After about 20 plus years of fighting, in 241 BC, Carthage finally folds. And it's a true testament to the resilience of the Republic and the men who served it that they were able to defeat the Carthaginians. Historian Edward J. Watts argues that a big part of this victory for Rome was the ability of the institutions of the Republic to provide the incentives. As we talked about in the previous episode, military service was something that could gain you glory and wealth and fame, and in particular service to the Republic through your military campaigns. With this currency of prestige in circulation, ambitious Romans were rewarded by serving the state and keeping it alive. But that didn't mean that the cracks weren't already starting to form. About 20 years later, a new Carthaginian threat emerged by the name of Hannibal. Hannibal was a military genius in all probability, but he was also an expert at psychology, and he understood the way the Roman Republic worked, and he understood the way it incentivized not only its citizens to support the Republic and its leaders, but also the city-states that were allied with it. So here's what historian Edward J. Watts says about Hannibal. Quote, "Hannibal understood that Rome would again outlast Carthage in war unless he was able to demoralize Romans and peel away Roman allies to such a degree that Italian unity shattered. Hannibal also understood that the only way to accomplish this was to take his army away from Spain, march it into the heart of Italy, and defeat Romans on their home turf." End quote. So Hannibal famously marches his army, elephants and all, around Spain, into Rome, through the Alps, and he just begins crushing Roman armies. It seems that the Romans didn't realize the true threat that they were in. They blamed a couple of the consuls who were blowing these early battles, and they voted a guy in by the name of Flaminius. Now, Flaminius had been a tribune and a consul before, and he had initiated a couple of, many would call them populist or self-serving agendas. On the docket for him was land distribution. So he wanted to distribute some of this land in northern Italy to some Roman citizens. Now, this is kind of a theme that we're going to be getting a lot more into here, but many people in the Senate and even some people lower in the Roman system were curious about Flaminius. Was this guy doing this because he actually wanted to help these people? Or was he doing this, giving away this land as a way to get extra voters, get himself in good with the lower classes, and then propel his political career? So did he actually care about these people, or was he just cynically trying to use the system to get power? At any rate, Flaminius seems to sense an opportunity here. If he can be the one to crush Hannibal, that's going to give him an opportunity to get more wealth, more glory, more of that Roman virtue going for him. So Flaminius rushes out to go meet Hannibal, hoping to win glory quickly, and he ends up getting slammed and killed at a place called Lake Trasimene. 15,000 Romans are dead. There's even more casualties. Flaminius is dead, and Rome goes into a panic. They elect a dictator by the name of Fabius Maximus, and he incorporates a strategy of, look, we can't beat this guy in open battle, let's just delay. So he didn't feel the need to prevail quickly and score political points. His goal was to rebuild Roman morale, rebuild the army, and then when he gets the opportunity, perhaps he'll have the chance to take down Hannibal. The public apparently doesn't like this delaying strategy. They elect a new guy. He goes in there, and he goes more with a direct conflict approach. This leads to the Battle of Cannae, which is just a total mass slaughter. Tens of thousands of Romans would die, including a consul, and Rome was truly in danger of falling at this point. The city was in total panic. That Fabius Maximus guy has to get elected again, appointed again as a dictator. The city is in panic. People are sacrificing each other to the gods. It's total craziness. So it seems like here it's worth pausing and noting that probably this was the Roman Republic at its most strained moment in history. It's difficult to imagine in the modern day, but you have to imagine an army roaming around your country, thrashing its way through your homeland and doing what it wanted. All the while this was happening, Hannibal was taking some of those Roman city-states and putting them in his back pocket. So as we talked about before, much of Rome's power on the Italian peninsula rested on the fact that it was the dominant city-state, and it controlled the other city-states, and that was a big backbone of its foreign policy. So Hannibal thought, if we can take away those foreign city-states and put them under my control, perhaps Rome will fall apart. So with Fabius back in as dictator, he reincorporates that delaying strategy, but they're losing city after city to Hannibal, and the balance of power is shifting, and the web of alliances that Rome was usually the master of is beginning to fall apart. Again, you have to imagine an army roaming around the United States, and one day you hear that New York City has fallen to the enemy, and then Boston voluntarily goes over to the enemy. And now you're hearing that Chicago is toying with the idea of going over to the enemy. And that's what it was like for the people in Rome every time one of these city-states fell or one of these city-states switched over to Hannibal's side. At this point, the Roman Republic had no choice but to essentially morph into total war. It's estimated by historians that 70% of Roman citizens between the age of 17 and 30 went to war at this time. There were armies and navies all over the place. And the Republic had to become adaptable. So traditionally, only consuls or praetors could command armies. But now that they had over 20 legions across the Mediterranean, they had no choice but to adapt. Whether it be different types of Romans commanding armies, whether it be wealthy Romans extending credit to the state in order to pay for the war, whether it be the Senate adapting economically time and time again, the Republic did what it had to survive. Historian Edward J. Watts talks about this from an economic perspective. Quote, "When money was short after the defection of many Roman allies after Cannae, the Senate relied on credit extended by its own members and other wealthy Romans to pay for the war. It also devalued Roman coinage in an effort to stretch what resources it did have. Then, after Rome began receiving influxes of precious metal from the capture of Syracuse in 212, the Senate pivoted again and remade the Roman monetary system so it was based around a silver coin called the denarius. This addressed the inflation problem devaluation had caused. When this influx of precious metal proved inadequate to meet the expenses of the war, the Senate agreed to the sale of land confiscated following the reconquest of disloyal Italian allies. End quote. So while that may not be sound fiscal policy according to your economics textbooks, it's demonstrating that the Roman Senate is going to do whatever it takes to win this war. And, oh, by the way, if they have to punish those old Italian allies who defected over to Hannibal, they have no qualms about doing that. Another challenge for the Roman Republic during the Punic Wars, aside from Hannibal, aside from the economic issues we talked about, aside from the Italian allies peeling away from the Roman alliance, a challenge formed in the person of Scipio. Scipio was a Roman commander who I believe was actually at the Battle of Cannae, managed to escape with his life, fought and won a bunch of battles against Carthage and Spain, but he got denied a triumph. He was one of these guys where the Senate was kind of worried, what's he really after here? But the people loved him. He's elected consul in 205, and he wants to take the fight right to Carthage. He wants to take the fight to Africa. He wants to forget this Fabian strategy of delaying. And again, many people in the Senate and in the political realm of Rome were worried that this was a ploy for individual rewards. So one of the themes that's starting to develop here in this downfall of the Republic is that there's always a delicate balance when the Republic provides all of the incentives. So if you're a person like Scipio, you can go out and you can gain all of the wealth and the fame and the glory in service of the Republic, but a cynical person might wonder, what are you going to do with all that wealth and power and fame once you achieve it? Are you going to use it for self-serving ambition, or are you going to use it just in the service of the Republic? At any rate, Scipio gets his wishes, he gets his army, and he goes and he ends up defeating Hannibal in Africa at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Scipio would negotiate a peace treaty where Carthage would have to give up a ton of territory, some economic concessions, its military essentially would be non-existent. It would have to pay reparations to Rome for over 50 years. Decades later, there would actually be a Third Punic War where that's essentially just a fancy term for saying Rome just burned Carthage to the ground, completely destroying it. But most historians say it's the Second Punic War that really changed the way the Republic worked, and it changed the way the Republic operated. I know I kind of just breezed through the Punic Wars very quickly there, but my intention wasn't really to get into the military aspect of it. It was more to talk about some of the events that I think are important to understand why the Punic Wars had such an impact on the Roman Republic and the victory in the Punic Wars and how that changed the way the Republic worked, which ultimately was helping to lead to disaster. So historian Edward J. Watts says, quote, "When the war with Hannibal started, the Republic controlled territory only in Italy and its surrounding islands. It fielded perhaps 4 legions in any given year, its economy was underdeveloped, and agriculture depended heavily on small-scale cultivation, and the Republic had only minimal involvement with political affairs in Spain, Greece, or Africa. The Second Punic War changed all of this. It required Roman soldiers to fight in theaters across the Mediterranean, and the conduct of such an expansive war compelled Rome to fundamentally alter both its relationship to other polities and the operations of its own government. Once the fighting ended, however, Rome could neither demobilize nor dismantle the political and economic systems it had created to win it. Rome could not pull back from the areas its forces had entered, and it needed to maintain the economic, military, and political structures that allowed it to exert influence over them." End quote. What he's saying there is that before the Second Punic War, Rome largely controlled Italy. After the Second Punic War, Rome fought in Africa. Rome fought in Spain. Rome fought in Sicily, Gaul. Now they had huge amounts of territories that they were relying on as far as foreign alliances and economic systems. As such, of course, the size of the military is now going to increase. By the nature of being involved in all these places, Rome is much more attuned and involved in foreign affairs, particularly Greek affairs. The economy has to change due to the influx of all the plunder from these captured cities. It seems that many historians agree that Rome had to adapt to win the war. And as far as winning goes, many historians commend Rome and the Roman values and the Roman adaptability and the way that Rome's political system was adaptable, and it provided incentives for people to donate to the Republic and provide service to the Republic. And all of that is great, but many historians also think that they ultimately were doomed, and the Republic doomed itself because Rome could never go back to the way things were. Rome was now in the position of governing Spain, Greece, Africa, essentially the entire Mediterranean, controlling, campaigning, maintaining. And all of this is going to change the values, the incentives, and the social currencies that the Republic used to control. It's going to become much more difficult to control these things now that this new round of expansion is taking place. Here's what Edward J. Watts says, where the ideals of honorable service and Roman ambition are changing, quote, in a world where wars did not always end. Administrative appointments dragged on for many years, and conquest brought wealth as well as glory. As the 2nd century dawned, leading Romans gradually grew to realize that elite ambition and competition were growing ever more heated at precisely the moment when the Republic was beginning to lose its monopoly on the social currency that mattered to those elites. End quote. Many historians now argue that although the entire system was still governed by a republic, the end of the Second Punic War basically indicates that Rome was now essentially an empire. They had territories all over the Mediterranean. They were exerting control all over the place. They seemed to be in endless war after war. And Rome had to spend the next couple of decades trying to figure out how to govern these new territories. Initial instinct told the Romans that they should try to do things as indirectly as possible. So the Senate didn't want to be too direct at first. They wanted to start with more of an indirect system of control. But the problem with imperialism and the problem with exerting control over vast amounts of territory is that these foreign situations and these foreign wars have a way of sucking you in, and there's a way of sort of these unintended consequences really wreaking havoc. Sort of a foreign policy mission creep, if you will. An example of this indirect policy of imperial control happened in Greece. So Rome found itself in control, essentially, of most of Greece, and instead of governing it directly, they placed a couple of different regional powers in control. They made sure that all of these local powers were loyal to Rome and not to each other. So it was sort of like a NATO situation. Rome said, look, if anybody messes with these guys, then you're messing with us. And if you're messing with us, then you're going to have problems. And unfortunately for them, that's exactly what ends up happening. They're squabbling amongst these kind of client kingdoms and civil wars, and these types of violent disturbances are seen back in Rome as a threat to the peace and ultimately a threat to Rome. So now with this foreign policy of indirect control and the combination of that overexpansion and Rome finding itself in control of territories, they see themselves as having to solve problems that they were ultimately responsible for causing. Another example of this slow mission creep, where the Romans were slowly getting dragged into the affairs of other territories, was actually a situation that involved Hannibal, their old nemesis from the Second Punic War. There was a kingdom in what the Romans probably would have called Asia, but probably just the Eastern Mediterranean, and this guy who's in charge of this kingdom puts Hannibal in charge of an army, and he sends it to Greece, perhaps calculating that Rome might not be as strong and powerful as it was before, and you now have Hannibal, public enemy number one in Rome, wreaking havoc in Greece, killing Romans, roaming around with an army. Obviously, the Senate, the consuls, the people of Rome are incredibly fearful of Hannibal after what happened during the Second Punic War, and obviously Rome isn't going to allow that. So now all of a sudden they're in a situation where they have to go solve this problem, and they go in deeper and deeper with these types of wars and these types of situations, and you can see how slowly over time it's like quicksand, where it's just slowly dragging you into more wars, more conquests, more imperial control. So after these early growing pains, the Senate perhaps realizes that maybe direct control is the answer. So instead of allowing these client kingdoms to kind of pay tribute to us, why don't we just turn this thing full-blown into an empire? We'll establish basically territories that are ours. We'll put a governor in charge. It'll be direct control. It seems like a logical solution. So an example of this happened in Spain, where you had that type of situation, a more direct approach, but unfortunately for the people of Spain, this led to brutal suppression of any sort of dissent or rebellion, and it turns out there was plenty of rebellions with guerrilla tactics and all sorts of nasty warfare tactics to go around from those indigenous Spanish people. And of course, this leads to prolonged wars and a situation where Rome would be in Spain for years. Many historians see that Third Punic War that we mentioned earlier as sort of the final changing of the guard moment, where Rome cemented itself as an empire, and it really dove into this idea of constant warfare and the idea that foreign policy problems can be solved by conquest. Of course, many people would say that moment happened long before, but if you weren't convinced by now, then the Third Punic War really set the tone for Rome's status as an empire. The Third Punic War is seen by pretty much everybody today as deeply unethical, and it was actually seen by many at the time as deeply unethical, including Polybius, the historian we mentioned earlier. Ultimately, it was the result of attitudes in Rome, and particularly attitudes in the Roman Senate towards Carthage, changing over time. So, for example, there was a senator by the name of Cato who ended every speech, supposedly, with the quote, "Carthage must be destroyed." There seemed to be a sense among people like Cato that if Carthage was out there in any capacity whatsoever, then it could be a threat to Rome. And if we're already out there in Greece and in Spain and in these other places defending Rome, then why not deal with Carthage once and for all? So ultimately, on a dubious charge, Rome goes to war. They burn the city to the ground. They enslave its inhabitants. This happens in 146 BC, by the way. And it seemed to be that final nail in the coffin as far as Rome is now officially an empire that isn't just in control of essentially the entire Mediterranean, but it's in a constant state of warfare. Here's what historian Edward J. Watts says, quote, "The nearly endless warfare of the period had profound demographic and economic consequences that combined to shatter the politics of cooperation and consensus that had long governed Roman political life." End quote. For example, a look at population numbers during this period of Roman expansion is enlightening. So during the Second Punic War, it's not a surprise at all to see that the number of male citizens declined from 270,000 to 137,000, according to the Roman census. But over the next 100 years or so, as Rome was making this incredible push towards being the dominant power in the Mediterranean, there was a booming population, and the population was replenished many times over. This had to do with a number of factors. So the Roman population had lots of economic opportunities, and particularly agricultural opportunities. Roman citizens and allies could settle in these new territories that were being conquered. They could also go to new colonies that were being established, and they could rent farmland or start out on their own. The Roman government could also give out all of that confiscated land in Italy that came from the city-states that allied with Hannibal during the Second Punic War. So if you remember, Hannibal's strategy was to get some of these Roman allies and turn those city-states against Rome. So obviously once Rome defeated Hannibal and won the war, they punished those city-states pretty heavily and essentially just gave out all their land to Roman citizens. As the population was getting bigger and bigger and families were getting bigger, farms began to be divided up into smaller and smaller pieces by families. It was common to give your farm away to your son as an inheritance, and when you have multiple sons, you give away the farm in smaller and smaller portions. This meant that over time, there was less overall wealth for the farming class, and some farms became small enough to no longer qualify for military service. So remember, owning property and being a citizen were the requirements for being in the Roman military, and many no longer had that option. As overpopulation continued and the population continued to grow, people had less and less options in the countryside, and the natural move is to move into the city, specifically Rome. During this period of expansion, Rome grew from a city of about 200,000 to a city of 500,000 by the 130s BC. In addition to poor farmers moving into Rome, you also had immigrants who were basically Italians who weren't citizens moving into the city looking for opportunities. And in the meantime, the rich were getting richer. And this was happening in a variety of different ways. The first and probably most well-known of this new mode of wealth accumulation was the huge amount of plunder that was coming back from this constant warfare. So as the Roman legions were going out and conquering territories and cities and empires, they were taking back to Rome, to the Roman treasury, all that silver, all that gold, all the precious metals, all of the valuable materials, and by and large, it's the political elites who were reaping the benefits and the wealth from this situation. Historian Edward J. Watts says that, quote, "There can be no doubt that the wars in Greece and those against Carthage transferred massive amounts of booty back to Rome. Scipio Africanus, for example, brought 123,000 pounds of silver to the treasury following his victory over Hannibal at Zama, and Lucius Cornelius Lentulus brought 43,000 pounds of silver and 2,450 pounds of gold taken from Spain in 200 BC. The sums taken in the Macedonian and Syrian wars seem to have dwarfed even these hauls. In addition to precious metals, these wars brought substantial numbers of slaves, including a reported 150,000 captured by Aemilius Paulus in 167 BC, worth the equivalent of 141,000 pounds of silver." End quote. Most of that plunder is staying in the hands of the upper class. Hundreds of thousands of slaves are being imported into Rome. Wealthy landowners are able to use those slaves as cheap labor, and this is making it difficult, if not impossible, for these small landowners and the small landowning farmers to compete. So you began to see these wealthy landowners who owned slaves kind of swallowing up these smaller farms that weren't able to keep up, either by waiting them out or buying them out. Keep in mind that oftentimes small landowners were off fighting in wars while the situation on their farms was deteriorating, and it made it easy for these slave-owning plantation-style farmers to make the moves necessary to acquire new land and acquire land that used to belong to poorer Roman citizens. In addition to plunder and slaves that were coming in huge numbers to the Italian peninsula, you also had a new source of wealth. And this new source of wealth was tax revenue. As the Roman Senate decided we're going to administer these imperial territories in a more direct fashion, they realized that the tax revenue from these new territories in Africa and Spain and Greece was tremendous. Roman officials particularly enjoyed the tax revenue system because it was permanent and it was predictable. Another huge source of wealth creation for largely the upper class was the mining of precious metals all around the Mediterranean. So there were huge operations that were bringing in gold and silver in ridiculous numbers back to Rome. The treasury was expanding, and Rome now had the funding to create massive public works projects in Rome specifically, but really all over Roman-controlled territories of the Mediterranean. Bridges, sewer systems, ports, roads, aqueducts. But while all of this is happening and the government and the republic seems to be healthy, there's also a development of a super wealthy class of political elites that in large measure is happening behind the scenes. The reality of the situation was, as Rome expanded, as these new sources of wealth became obvious and predictable and just right there for the taking, right within these wealthy people's grasp, corruption entered the political scene more so than in any other time during the Roman Republic. What you saw was a massive increase in the role of money in politics. For example, the new system of tax collection needed contractors, basically. The government needed to pick contractors to handle the tax collection in these territories. So there became what was known as a contract system. The government would pick contractors. Oftentimes this happened in corrupt fashion. You can imagine some money changing hands under the table gets you a contract to go to some territory where you can handle the tax collection however you see fit. In order to handle the tax collection as well as create the public works in that area, you would essentially create what we would probably call today a corporation, but it's this huge cabal of senators, political elites, and wealthy Romans who are able to plunder, tax, and loot their way to incredible wealth. Here's historian Edward J. Watts talking about how the Roman Republic basically outsourced all of this tax collection and public works and contract work to these contractors. Quote, "Officers of the Republic outsourced this work to contractors. Contractors handled tax collection in the provinces, mining operations in Spain and Macedon, and the many infrastructure projects undertaken across Italy and the provinces. The censors and other agents of the Roman state awarded these contracts to individuals or syndicates of investors who then subcontracted parts of them to others. Polybius famously wrote that, quote, almost everyone is involved either in the sale of these contracts or in the kinds of business to which they give rise." End quote. Back to Edward J. Watts now. These contracts brought paid work to the engineers, architects, tax collectors, and manual laborers ultimately employed by subcontractors, it is true, but the Roman elites who bid on the projects made far more money from them. In this way, public contracts resembled the division of war plunder among the Republic's elites. Average Romans certainly benefited from them, but the disproportionate share of this wealth that went to the elite Romans made many of them extremely rich. End quote. As I was researching about this, it's just hard not to think that that whole situation sounds very familiar. And perhaps even more modern for these senators and political elites, it wasn't just plunder and public contracts. They were involved in complex investment schemes involving all of this stuff. I mean, these guys had widely diversified investments that included land deals, trade deals, money lending, industrial properties, mining, and it was all connected together. Here's an example of one of those schemes. I'm getting a lot of this from Edward J. Watts, so go check out his book. It's called Mortal Republic, but here's an example of one of those investment schemes I referred to. Quote, like a modern home mortgage that is packaged into a bond and resold, a wealthy man like Cato could sell the debt of his investors and then reinvest the proceeds in another venture. As long as the wealthy investor could continue to front the initial capital on a shipping voyage or public contract, he could almost perpetually loan money to other investors looking to buy shares in the venture and then either reinvest the paper profits in a new scheme or use them to buy agricultural or investment property. People with access to capital could then quickly and dramatically increase their wealth if they managed their investments skillfully. End quote. Aside from reminding you of an episode of Ozark where this money is moving around all over the place, it reminds you of a modern 21st century strategy of wealth accumulation. Money and wealth is now a goal in and of itself. The opportunities are too obvious. It's too easy for these political elites to engage in schemes like this. Everybody else is doing it. The corruption is rampant, and you could use political office, or at least connections to political office, to get money, to get wealth, to get investments, and to use those investments to benefit yourself. Edward J. Watts sums up that point here saying, quote, the days in which personal qualities, honors, and family pedigree mattered far more than wealth were receding. By the end of the 3rd century, ambitious politicians had no doubt that money had become deeply intertwined with the pursuit of public office. End quote. For those that were benefiting from this situation, everything was becoming more lavish. There were huge feasts that lasted for days. They were full of ostentatious and opulent stuff. New public works buildings, new temples, new roads. I mean, in 161 BC, the Senate actually issued a law limiting the amount of silver that you could display in your home. This shows the amount of wealth that was on display at a lot of these places. Whether it be luxury houses, vacation homes, luxury goods, you name it, these people had it. It just seems like as the amount of wealth that was possible to own went up, that it just makes sense that people could just become richer in this new complicated economy. And that simple fact meant that the opportunities for corruption were going to go through the roof. A great example of this is Edward J. Watts comparing Scipio Africanus, probably the wealthiest Roman in Roman history at the time he was large and in charge, around 188 BC, to Crassus, who was probably one of the richest Romans ever, maybe the richest Roman ever, just a century later. And it's clear that Scipio Africanus' level of wealth isn't even close. He's playing in the minor leagues. So here it is, quote, Scipio Africanus, for example, was likely both the richest Roman of his time and the richest Roman who had ever lived at that time of Rome's victory over Antiochus III in 188 BC. Crassus, the richest Roman a little more than a century later, at one point controlled a fortune worth nearly 40 times what Scipio possessed. The natures of their fortunes were as different as their relative sizes. Scipio's fortune largely consisted of tangible things of value, taken from Carthage and Spain, that remained in his possession. Crassus's fortune, by contrast, largely existed on paper, and not as physical objects contained in a vault. It was much more liquid than the fortune of Scipio, and because of this, it could be easily invested in ways that would enable it to grow much more rapidly. End quote. So the super rich, wealthy Romans were getting wealthier with relative ease, but many other classes of Roman society were not benefiting from that Roman expansion as much, if at all. Here's Edward J. Watts, quote, some of the established families who were falling behind economically became increasingly concerned that they could not compete effectively in this new environment. Population growth within Italy meant that the economic outlook of many Romans in the mid-2nd century was bleaker than that which faced their parents. Many of the rural Italians who were forced to share small homes and farm small plots of land with members of their extended families were just barely making it. These were the seasonal laborers employed at the olive groves and vineyards of the rich during harvest time. These were also the dock workers and craftspeople who moved to Rome and other cities to find steady work. They knew that their lots were worse than their parents. They also saw firsthand how their relative poverty compared to the unprecedented opulence that the richest Romans now enjoyed. The new economy produced great wealth for a few winners, but the frustration of the newly poor and the fear that some of the old elite were losing their grip on power created conditions in which a fierce populist reaction could occur. End quote. Quite simply, the gap between the rich and poor was getting bigger and bigger, and life was getting more difficult for the poor. And when you combine the gap between the rich and the poor getting wider with huge numbers of population increases and the threat of overpopulation, you're ripe for a populist breakout. Frustration was building among a wide spectrum of the Roman population, and a new class of politician was coming of age that wasn't afraid to provoke populist sentiments to get what they wanted, even if it put the stability of the Republic in jeopardy. And make no mistake about it, at this point, the stability of the Republic was in question. We talked about a number of themes where the Republic was beginning to fracture in a number of ways, whether it be military leaders using government positions or military commands as a springboard to personal wealth, glory, or power, whether it was Roman overexpansion and the host of problems that brought from foreign policy to domestic issues to economics to wealth inequality. The system was bending, and soon enough, it was going to break.